Good afternoon. I'm Jim Ferris, and I'm a professor in the Saul Price School of Public Policy, and I have the pleasure of serving as the director of the USC Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy. I'm delighted that you all could join us for our 2016 National Leadership Forum, Philanthropy and Government, Public Problem Solving at the Intersection. Since the center's inception, it has focused on philanthropic strategies for addressing society's most pressing problems. We have examined strategies for working to impact the policymaking process. We have explored how to best catalyze, accelerate, and sustain public-private partnerships, including the innovation of offices of strategic partnership. And more recently, we have and are studying how to build stronger and more vibrant communities and cities by focusing on places where philanthropy comes together with government and the market. Over the past 16 years, we have been heartened by the growing interest in philanthropy to be willing to become more engaged in public policy work and to work in partnership with government and business. In the process, philanthropy has learned a lot, as it has taken more risk and come to realize that it can leverage more than just grants. Its knowledge, its reputation, talent, and investments. There is the potential for scaling impact and for philanthropy to come closer to realizing its full potential. We see this forum as an opportunity to take stock, to underscore the many ways in which philanthropy and government intersect by examining policy issues that highlight these roles and reflecting on what it takes to do this work, the strategies and tactics, and the culture and practices, so that philanthropy can expand its impact even further. Today, we kick off by examining arenas in which philanthropy is intersecting with government in some big ways, getting us to increased healthcare access, rebuilding American cities, and improving our governing institutions. Following the opening plenary, we'll have an opportunity in somewhat more intimate settings to dig deeper into these themes and others, such as immigrant integration and charter schools. As we do so, we want to ask a number of questions. What are the roles for philanthropy and government and their partners? How are these new roles challenging the conventional wisdom? What are the rules of engagement? What drives the sectors to forge these new arrangements? What does success look like? And what are the downsides? What do we as philanthropy need to do differently? And we'll conclude today with a keynote address by Monica Lozano, who is going to focus on strategic leadership, foundation governance in an era of partnership. After all, as foundations move more into the intersection with government, there is a need for shared governance and responsibility between foundation boards and their senior leadership. Tomorrow, we will pivot and look more intensely about the implications for how foundations can best work at the intersection. We'll begin the morning with a plenary with Bill Eggers and some of his colleagues to talk about the importance of systems and networks that engage not only philanthropy and government, but communities, corporations, social entrepreneurs. This will be followed by a set of breakouts looking at specific strategies that we think are among those that can really make a big difference. Impact investing, supporting movements and networks, public-private partnerships, and strategic communications. And we're going to conclude the forum over lunch with a panel of distinguished philanthropic leaders who are going to sort of ask the question, what do we need to do differently? So we have a lot in store in a short amount of time, and it's really hot outside, so I'm glad you're here for all those people from the Midwest and East. So anyway, I want to now introduce my good friend and colleague, one of the founding members of the Center on Philanthropy's Board of Advisors, Wendy Wachtell.
Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for all being here. And I'm a little different than Jim. I hope that you get to come enjoy, those of you from Points East get to enjoy our February sunshine. 4 of our 5 children live on the East Coast, so I am the first to point out our wonderful February sunshine on a regular basis, trust me. But I thank you for being here, and I take really great pride in all of the Center's accomplishments over the past 16 years. The Center for Philanthropy and Public Policy has emphasized research and analysis as a means to really deepening our understanding of the complex issues of philanthropy and ensuring that these important topics are addressed in our field. By conducting groundbreaking studies and widely sharing the findings, the Center has provided in-depth knowledge of philanthropy's changing landscape, as well as strategies for action. This empowers people who are philanthropic decision makers, policymakers, civic leaders, and donors with information and insights needed to create meaningful change, both independently and collectively. That's people like you and me. The Center has forged a really important place in the field of philanthropy and has served as a resource for all of us. Our early work in new philanthropy and changing landscapes has become a benchmark for the field and set the stage for subsequent research. These studies have had a national impact and regional relevance. The Center leads the way in helping philanthropy create change. It's done groundbreaking work on foundation engagement in public policy process, helping us understand at what point in the process to act, in which arena, whether that be local, state, or national, and how to do so. Through our research exploring the innovative role in the offices of strategic partnerships in catalyzing and stimulating partnerships between philanthropy and government in cities, states, and across the federal government, the Center's brought light to the advantages of philanthropy and the nonprofit sector working together with government and business. And as Jim mentioned, there is more recent work on place-based philanthropy. The Center is currently conducting an inquiry in partnership with the Kresge Foundation on lesson learned in Detroit's recent experience and new approaches that are emerging. These approaches may hold the potential to drive the next generation of urban policy and practice in urban revitalization, and may suggest problem-solving pathways that shift traditional boundaries, define new pathways, new civic roles, and frame new narratives about how positive change can take place in American cities. In all of the Center's work, we have intentionally engaged the field so that the work is useful and usable. That's our intent here today, with the extraordinary people in this room who are working at the intersection of philanthropy and government from such a broad array of vantage points, from foundation leaders and trustees, philanthropists and corporate leaders, to infrastructure leaders, scholars, and students. It's clear that the Center has achieved much success since its founding in 2000. And, as is evident from the impressive gathering, it provides a forum that helps it strengthen philanthropy and its capacity for public problem solving. I'd like to take a moment and thank our sponsors, whose generous support has enabled us to put together this outstanding forum. Among them, J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Northrop Grumman, the Ralph Parsons Foundation, the Annenberg Foundation, Bank of America, California Community Foundation, the California Wellness Foundation, and of course, the Center's philanthropic partners. I'd also like to recognize my fellow board members. Our board represents a group of leaders from philanthropy and the community who have made a significant commitment to the Center. There are a number of you in this room who have supported this Center from the very beginning, and we are deeply appreciative for that support. The people and organizations that you see listed in your program as philanthropic partners are truly a unique group. They realize that philanthropy, like any other field, benefits from careful study, discussion, and debate. And like me, they believe in the importance of building our field. I encourage you to consider joining us in creating a more informed and thoughtful group of philanthropic leaders and donors who work and helps build a better future and with greater impact. So now it's time for us to get started. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce the opening plenary on achieving greater impact. This panel will examine the range of possibilities where solutions to public problems can benefit from the interactions between philanthropy and government, foundations influencing the public policy process, strategic partnerships between philanthropy and government, enhancing democratic processes, and improving civic performance. I'd like to introduce the moderator for the panel and a good friend. Fred Ali is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Weingart Foundation, a private foundation that supports nonprofit organizations in more effectively addressing the needs of low-income and underserved individuals and communities in Southern California. Fred also chairs the Center's Board of Advisors, providing great leadership and vision for all that we do. Please welcome Fred Ali.
As you all know, as Jim noted, this is a forum focused on philanthropy and government working together in public problem solving. And it's hard for me to believe that I'm actually entering or leaving, I can never remember, my 17th year of work at the Weingart Foundation. And as I look back over that time, probably a major change that I certainly see, maybe the biggest change, is this willingness on the part of philanthropy to engage government around issues of common concern. And so that's what we're all here to talk about today. We have seen an increase in collaboration between philanthropy and government, creative financing, and other approaches that contribute to social change. Joining me on today's panel are three individuals who know a lot about this work and who certainly need little introduction in this room. Larry Kramer, the president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Larry, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Rip Rapson, the president and chief executive officer of the Kresge Foundation. And Bob Ross, the president and chief executive officer of the California Endowment. So thank you all for being here. So let me just make a couple introductory remarks. Under their leadership, each of these foundations have made very big and impressive multi-million-dollar bets in, if I can call it, the philanthropy government space. Rip and Kresge with the revitalization of Detroit, Larry and Hewlett through the Madison project, and Bob in the Endowment through the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. All of these initiatives are tackling difficult and very complex issues in distinct and very unique ways, with a focus on cross-sector collaboration at different levels of government. To borrow, and Rip, I hope you don't mind this, I'm going to borrow something that I've heard you say. This work reflects a boldness of philanthropic aspiration, and in my mind, deserves our respect and certainly our thoughtful consideration. So we're going to spend the next hour or so exploring the work of these foundations, what's behind these initiatives, where they came from, what's being accomplished, what have been the challenges, and most importantly, what they're learning, what you're learning that we can apply to the field. To the extent that you're willing, I have encouraged our panelists to talk with one another, and we can eavesdrop on their conversation. If time permits, later on in the presentation, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. So let me start with this great group of panelists. And Rip, I want to start with you. And I'm going to ask actually all of you to do this. If you could just provide a brief overview of the work you've been engaged in Detroit for all these years.
Sure. Thanks, Fred. The work in Detroit, I think, is often or has recently become sort of synonymous with the bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. And I want to try to avoid that for a moment, although I'm happy to circle back and talk about the bankruptcy. Because I think what actually happened in Detroit was such an utter breakdown of public private, nonprofit systems, that it forced philanthropy's hand. I wish it were a sort of a more noble and elegant way of causing us to sort of take a different cut at our work, but in 2008, 2009, I need to remind this audience, not only did the recession buffet Detroit, but the foreclosure crisis hit Detroit particularly hard. But we also had a private sector whose driving forces, the auto industry, were in bankruptcy themselves, and we had a mayor who was being sent to the federal penitentiary. So we had no public sector to speak of, no private sector to speak of, and a nonprofit sector that was always sort of hanging on by a string and just had its circumstance exacerbated by all of this. So in many ways, philanthropy had no choice but to step up, try to sing off the same song sheet and to get something done. And we were blessed in that we had both local philanthropy that was, I think, prepared to do that, as well as national philanthropy, the Ford Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, and others. But what happened between 2008 and the bankruptcy, which was begun in 2013, was a remarkable creation of what I think of as sort of a temporary scaffolding, a set of actions and a set of sort of long-term bets that enabled the bankruptcy ultimately to move quickly to resolution and to sort of set the stage for the next generation of Detroit's rebirth. And that scaffolding really implicated philanthropy in Detroit in a very different way. Let me just very quickly tick off a number of things, I think, Fred, that maybe we could come back to. And none of these is new. I think philanthropy all across the country is doing bits and pieces of this. But when aggregated, it seemed to me to be a fairly extraordinary pivot point for philanthropy's conception of its role in a major American city. So one is just basic table setting, the idea that there was no one in Detroit to set the table for major civic conversations. So whether it was Detroit's land use work or its arts and cultural work or whatever cut you take at sort of its civic life, someone needed to step up, and different parts of the philanthropic ecology did that. Second, there was an enormous call on philanthropy to try to figure out how to creatively build civic capacity where it didn't exist, particularly in the public sector. And we were drawn fairly early on into a series of moves that were quite uncomfortable for us because it seemed as if we were supplanting or at least supplementing in pretty dramatic ways the ability of the public sector to do what people expected it to do. Third was the more conventional, but I think quite important, sort of role of risk taker. There were just too many transactions where the market was just running out of the room as fast as it could go. And the disinvestment levels in Detroit were just staggering. And so for philanthropy to be able to sort of take the first layer of risk, or as Judy Roden says, sort of peel away the first layer of risk to encourage private actors to get into the game was tremendously important as you're trying to do a housing deal or a public spaces deal or a commercial deal or a combination of all of the above. Fourth, we were increasingly called on to serve as a guarantor of value, as making the kinds of investments in the public realm that would signal back to the marketplace that Detroit was an investable proposition. So we took the lead in helping get off the ground a new riverfront revitalization program, and the new Riverwalk and Riverfront Conservancy grew out of that. Probably most outrageously, but I think over the long term, perhaps most importantly, is that we put the first $50 million at Kresge on the table to create a light rail system that would become the first leg of a regional transit system. We can talk more about it. It was crazy, and my board just about ran out of the room as well, or asked me to run out of the room. But a number of those kinds of plays that became tremendously important for the private sector to believe that there were the kinds of civic undergirdings that any healthy community needed. Fifth is that we became a seller. We increasingly called up colleagues in the federal government and philanthropy and investment partners and tried to encourage them to come to Detroit, take a look, and we essentially became a Sherpa. We essentially were able to sort of create sort of some more sophisticated sense of the ground truth that would enable ultimately folks who had very little working knowledge of the on-the-ground situation in Detroit comfortable in coming. And sixth, and finally, and it's a more traditional role, but in a time of this kind of acute transition and crisis, it became important. We, as the philanthropic community, simply had to help steward really fragile ecologies of arts and culture, the emerging food system in Detroit, and particularly human services organization. There simply was not the support from any quarter for those entities to sort of get through the crisis without philanthropic help. So I think when you aggregate those roles, Fred, it became a moment of 4 or 5 years in which philanthropy couldn't substitute for government, but it could do a holding pattern. It could hold these systems sufficiently in place so that by the time the private sector and the public sector and even the nonprofit sector resumed their rightful roles, there was something to work with.
So thank you, and I want to come back to that. I'm interested to know when those 6 things became obvious. So Bob, I want to turn to you. So in 2013, I know I was surprised, happy. The California Endowment announced a $225 million commitment, if I'm not mistaken, to implementation of the Affordable Care Act. So can you talk about what that work has entailed?
Yeah, so one is, it's actually turned out to be an up to $350 million commitment.
Sorry.
Wow.
Don't be so shortchanging me, Fred. So look, by way of context, and this is, I know this is a different topic, although it's come up, Jim, because it's not necessarily directly related to government, but I'll get there. But how we got there started with a conversation about risk in the boardroom 12 years prior. And so shortly after I first got to the endowment, we had one board member in particular. Some of you may remember Harold Williams, who was the president of the Getty at the time, was on our board. And Harold had a strong philosophical aversion to risk aversion by philanthropy. And we had a conversation which Harold instigated about whether we should spend down our assets. It didn't get very far in terms of, it never became a motion and it never came to a vote. But the reason why we had that conversation was about the intersection of impact and risk and mission, right? And so even though Harold's thought was never reached the floor for a vote, where we landed instead was, okay, we're not going to spend down as a matter of course, but should a momentous opportunity for us to get closer to our mission arise, we should be fearless about spending more, okay? Hence the Affordable Care Act, right? And our mission has been about the underserved of low-income communities. We've been funding organizations who've been advocating for universal coverage and full coverage for Californians for a long time. When the legislation was passed, and everyone knows how rocky that was, went to the Supreme Court. We actually filed an amicus brief in support of the ACA. And when it finally got through that, we brought up, the board invited us to come back to, okay, what does making Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act wildly succeed in California, what would that look like? What could our role be? How do we help the state of California government, in this case, get there? And so the board gave us the degrees of freedom to come back with our best thinking, unconstrained. And in that up to $350 million commitment, which was over 3 to 4 years, which was roughly a 50% increase to 60% increase in our base spending year over year for that period of 3 to 4 years. So going from 5.5% annual to as much as 9% in some years. And I remember at the morning of the decisive vote, and in fact, one of my board members is here who actually made the motion, Steve Wachtell, who was a Republican, by the way. I'm sorry to out you, Steve. Steve made the motion because he and the board became convinced that, okay, so this is the biggest thing in healthcare in a half century. It's the biggest thing since Medicare and Medicaid. Everyone saw how much blood our president spilled to get this thing done. It's probably nothing of this size is going to happen again for quite some time. And it'll be horrible if we blow this opportunity in the state of California. And then we ran some numbers, and the numbers show that even if we invested the total of that $350 million in special funding, the leveraged benefit in health coverage, sustained health coverage, was exponential beyond the 350. I mean, I don't remember what the number was, but it was well into the billions. If you take 7 million uninsured Californians and then you get them covered, or most of them covered, and then you do a year-over-year analysis about the value of that coverage, you're talking about addressing a serious fundamental structural inequality with federal and state dollars, right? So at one level it seemed kind of scary, but at the other end it was a layup, okay, from a standpoint of ROI. Right? And in this case, our job became sort of 2 or 3-fold, but I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version. That up to $350 million commitment, a portion of it went to just help government and statewide and local allies support the right kind of outreach and education and enrollment, right? For Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. But there's also the Medicaid expansion. So how do we help state government with really a historical aversion to expanding Medicaid, because it's a public program with the stigma of welfare, virtually. How do we get? And we were, sometimes it's good to be good, and sometimes it's good to be lucky. We were lucky because the economy had been better and the state budget had been better. If this had been 10 years earlier, maybe a different kind of conversation. But California made tremendous inroads into expanding Medicaid. And we put a lot of our dollars into the expansion of Medicaid, right? And then the third piece was, okay, who's left out? And who was left out are immigrant and particularly undocumented populations. We're going to put some money on the table for a campaign to make sure that undocumented are not left out, right? That battle's not done, but many of our grantees and advocates won a major battle when the Health for All Kids bill was approved after a great campaign, where at least children of undocumented families can now get health coverage, right? So the board feels pretty good about what we've gotten thus far on that return on investment. And we played both with those dollars and Rip, I'm sure you've got this with the Detroit story. There's an inside game and there's an outside game. And some of us are not big enough to play inside and outside. You have to pick and choose one or the other. We're big enough to actually do both. So we funded the support of state government and covered California to make sure that outreach and enrollment would happen through an equity frame. And we funded advocates to beat the crap out of government to make sure they were accountable for making sure that folks got in. And it was a real, probably the high water mark, certainly of my time at the foundation, because we acted with intentionality and clarity and boldness in taking advantage of a public opportunity to leverage and to address structural inequality. And I'll just say this one last thing and then throw it back to you and Larry. I believe in helping, we believe in helping government and assisting government, not for the sake of assisting government. And those are not bad grants. If you're helping government be more efficient, that's fine. But to help our government address structural inequality in our nation. That's the fight of our time. And I think for philanthropy, we have to ask ourselves, are you in that fight or not? And if you're in that fight, how do you do better by it? And if you're not in it, why not? But structural inequality is the it right now, and I think philanthropy needs to help government do that better.
So thanks, Bob. So we have the example of a city strategy, a regional strategy in Detroit, the statewide strategy here in California, and now Larry, in 2014, you announced something called the Madison Project. I know when I read about it, I went, wow, this is bold. And this is focused on the federal level. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, it's Madison Initiative.
Initiative, I'm sorry.
It's funny, it actually comes from a different place, which is, so I actually start with the notion that the contribution philanthropy can make to most big problems is pretty modest at best. I mean, the fact is markets and government are going to have to take care of most of the problems that we have. So thinking about government then, there's a certain amount of stuff that can be done at the local level and a certain amount of stuff that can be done at the state level. But in this country, there's a huge number of really big problems, the most important problems that can only be handled at the federal level. And then on top of that, and one of the things I think we've seen over the last couple of years, is that you can do a certain amount with executive action, but you're going to run up against limits. And unfortunately, I think the limits are going to get a little tighter over the next year. And so you need a functioning Congress. So the idea behind the Madison Initiative actually wasn't to solve any particular problem so much as I like to jokingly say, it's to fix Congress so that they can address the whole array of problems. And the hole that we've dug ourselves into.
You want to fix this Congress?
I want to fix the institution. Well, part of fixing it's a really interesting set of issues. So the part of the problem. And the other background point to think about with respect to the Madison Initiative, I mean, it's named the Madison Initiative, is the U.S. constitutional system was structured deliberately to create a government that was designed to force compromises to take place within Congress. That's how it's designed. And if that can't happen anymore, and it can't, then you have a big problem, which is exactly what we have today. So we started with the notion political polarization is an effect, it's an outcome. It's the effect and the outcome of the fact that various things have happened within the structure of politics and the structure of the national government that make it impossible to achieve compromises inside Congress. Now, the two things people have to get out of their mind is either that a single heroic individual who is the president can change that. That's a ridiculous idea. But also that the problem is that there are just bad people in Congress, and if we just send different people, they'll do good. Because the fact, and there are some bad people in Congress, by the way, do not get me wrong, but there are plenty of people who are not, and plenty of people in Congress who would love to be able to address some of these problems and can't for various reasons. So the idea behind the Madison Initiative was really to say, and it's exploratory initially, is there a role that we can play in helping nudge some of the levers and restructure some of the institutions so that the people in Congress, whoever they happen to be, can do their jobs. And it's the long diagnosis. It actually has been a really difficult initiative to move along, partly because even apart from the problems inside Congress, there is now I'm going to be indiscreet here, there's a massive reform community that has been working on these problems that is making it worse. Most of the solutions that are out there are things that exacerbate rather than help with polarization, and so we have to move not just Congress, but we have to move the reform community to rethink what they're doing. And both the reform community and many other sort of foundations and funders who are working in the space, I find it really strange, aren't paying much attention to the evidence and what we know about what the source of these problems are. So we have we had to educate ourselves. We have a huge education issue as well before we can sort of begin to figure out what are the pressure points where we can where we can make things happen. We're still in the exploratory phase, although, we're getting it. I think we are feeling pretty comfortable that we have it's a long story about how we got into this, but I'll just touch briefly on what we see as places where we think we can begin to make a difference. Although, again, one last background point. The fundamental cause of all of this was a realignment that took place in the public at large, beginning really in the late 60s with Nixon's wedge strategy to run for president. So think of it this way. Why would I ever compromise with you if we're in Congress together? So there's basically three reasons I might compromise with you. One is we share a party. And in fact, that's the main one. And still, if we're in the same party, even if I disagree with you, I'm going to go along 80, 90% of the time. Two, we share an ideology. So I'm a liberal, you're a liberal. I'm a conservative, you're a conservative, regardless of which party you're in or if we're in different parties. And in the old days, you had people of different ideologies in both parties. So if I got most of my own party on party alliance, I could get enough people from the other party on ideological alliance that we could put together a compromise. And then the third basis is I just want to get something done because that's what I'm there for. And in particular, that was true for if I'm the chairman of the banking committee or the chairman, whatever, I just want to do some banking legislation. And I'm willing to do all sorts of compromising. So, what had happened first, the first major shift was, Nixon ran in a way that peeled off all the conservative Democrats and turned them into Republicans in the South. And as the Republican Party got more conservative, all the liberal Republicans in the North became Democrats. So now you're in a situation where if you're a conservative, you're a Republican, and if you're a liberal, you're a Democrat. And we've effectively lost that basis for compromise inside Congress. And there is nothing we can do about that. But that will take care of itself in time because issues are constantly changing, and eventually there'll be a resorting. But on top of that, we then layered a ton of other institutional obstacles that have made it even harder, so that even where there are instances where compromises might happen, we can't make it. So, for instance, we centralized power inside Congress so that committee chairs no longer have any power. It's up at the leadership level, and the leaders are always focused solely on the next election, so that we have effectively put a situation inside Congress where they are campaigning from the day after an election, they're campaigning for the next one already. And that makes it very hard to achieve any sort of compromises. So, and members of Congress stopped living in Washington. They only go there 3 days a week. They don't know each other. They have no sense of each other. There's a million different institutional changes that took place inside Congress, many of which are addressable, that just reduce the odds that people who might want to reach an agreement together can do so. That's inside Congress. Outside Congress, the single largest source of problem is primary elections. Caucuses are even worse, but for Congress, it's typically primary elections because the turnout is so low. So you get 10 to 15%, maybe 20% turnout in a primary from the most extremes. Well, you're going to get candidates that reflect that. And that's why gerrymandering has nothing to do with it. The only difference between a competitive district and an uncompetitive district is when you get to the general election, are you choosing between an extreme Democrat and an extreme Republican, or are you just choosing one of one of the other parties? But if you line them up from most to least competitive, the polarization, the ideological differences are exactly the same whether the district is competitive or not, and that's because the primary election turnout is so low. So we need to get people to vote in this pivotal election that takes us down to two candidates who are going to be our office holders. And then on top of that is the campaign finance problem. Although, and that's a really complicated problem, but campaign finance is actually not that significant in general elections. But it can be quite significant in primary elections because you have this tiny little voter turnout and it's only on one side of the spectrum and the money doesn't typically match. So candidates are spending way too much time raising money, whether it's in primary or general elections. But in primary elections, it can have a serious, and it adds on. So you've got an electorate that tends to be more at the extreme. You've got money coming in that's independent that will pull them even farther. So you've got candidates who, even if they would be inclined to veer off a little and maybe make a deal with somebody on the other side, cannot do so, right? Because they might as well just give up their office right now. And then on top of that, you layer the media, which, the so-called outrage industries, which will just lambaste you if you step off of the orthodoxy. So there are all these things, and the question is, what can we do about those? Can we do anything about those? And we think there are things that can be done, certainly a lot of things to fix a lot of the circumstances inside Congress that make it difficult for people when they want to compromise to do so. We think there are possibilities for affecting voter turnout in primaries. There have to be possibilities on campaign finance, although we haven't quite figured them out yet.
I just wanted you to comment briefly because I think it's an interesting part of this story. This is actually an idea you brought to the foundation, building maybe upon some work you had done in your academic career.
I was a law professor, and all of my writings were on courts, but what I was always interested in were what were the conditions that made democracy work. So I had like 25 years of writing on that, and had watched, what had happened. And to tell you the truth, for me, the wake-up point was 2008, because everything till then had kind of followed conventional wisdom about how this worked, and the speed with which Obama, having won in 2008 in a way that suggested that we were having one of those pivotal turning points, was kneecapped and proved unable to get anywhere near as much done as should have been the case, suggested that something different was going on. And so I started looking at it. And it's the first thing that got me interested in thinking about moving to the foundation. So when I interviewed for the job, and they were like, well, what do you think about what the Hewlett Foundation does? And my view is actually what the Hewlett Foundation does is great. These are all, income inequality is a huge problem. So is climate change. There are a lot of big, great, important problems out there. And the way I always put it is Hewlett works on 5 or 6 of the 20 that can claim to be the top 10. And that's pretty good. I'm comfortable with that. And I said to them, but, most of the things that we work on require government action of some sort. And if government can't act, then we're just wasting our time and our money. So this is sort of like a meta problem.
Well, and my assumption has been with all of you that the work you've just described, you brought with you to a certain extent into these positions. Bob, let me just quickly mention, you had the board discussion 12 years earlier around risk, but you had no idea Barack Obama was going to be elected president and he was going to focus on health care. But I'm sure weren't you thinking about this?
Well, a couple of things. One is, each of us are in these positions by virtue of our own, shape our own experiences, right? And then hopefully we're not static when we get in these jobs, right? And so for me, if I've had anything resembling a transformation in this leadership position, it has been around the urgency of inequality. We're a health foundation, so we get to see it through a health lens. And I've drifted. It's not that the science and the data and the evidence are unimportant. In our experience, fight and power and surrounding government so that it actually does the right thing on behalf of the communities it's supposed to serve, and not just the people who showed up in the last election, but all the people. So I think for us, the biggest swing for us has been from evidence-based philanthropy for its sake to power building and voice and advocacy, right? And so let's go to Larry, what Larry described with the Madison project.
Initiative,
I'm sorry.
Only matters inside our foundation. It's our own weird labeling.
So given, and maybe I'm cranky because of this particular presidential election and what people are saying, but I think less about compromise and more about winning.
Yeah.
Because if there were reasonable people who actually cared about people in this country, then I think compromise is a good thing. But I don't know how you compromise with somebody who wants to build an 800-foot wall at the border and then make Mexico pay for it. Like, what's the compromise there? We try to be better listeners to what we hear from the communities that we serve, and they're interested. And again, it's not. We do believe. We do fund research, we do believe in evidence, we do believe in science. I guess the flip has been, rather than the data and the science about what works leading, it's what is the experience and energy and creativity and passion of community and what they want, and how does the data and science back up what they want? and sort of more leading with that and leaning into that rather than the other way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Just to respond a little bit, which is, part of me goes, oh, that's the problem right there. But part of me, it's not. So again, I think it is different. At the state level, for instance, you can approach these, by the way, it's not about science. Science and evidence come into question when you're trying to figure out what's the best way to do whatever it is you have to do. It doesn't do it. And at the state level, it is actually occasionally possible to just say, you know what, let's just stick with this because we can beat the other side. But what we've seen at the national level is that's what has gotten us into this problem. And I promise you there are as many people on the other side who are thinking they're right and you're wrong and you're crazy. And it's not the Donald Trumps of there are people on the extremes at both ends. That is not the typical person. And so the question that we have to, at the national level, really what you saw in 2008, remember Obama won, he had a veto-proof majority and a huge majority in the House, and was still unable to get stuff done, and that's because of the way our politics was deliberately structured. So those are constitutional institutions. You're not going to get around those. So what we're turning politics into is sort of two roughly equally sized, guys standing in a ring, slugging it out with each other, each one convinced that just this next punch is going to knock the other guy out, and it doesn't. And all we're doing is beating the crap out of each other and getting nothing done and making things worse for everybody. So compromise is essential. Now, as I say, it's not true at all levels. You can do that at the state and local level, and that's really the design of the federal system was built around that concept. But national politics, it's not going to happen that way. And so unless we figure out a way to recreate room so that the people on the extremes don't have the voices that they have, because the people in the middle who are prepared to sort of take the necessary steps, even though they disagree with each other strongly, can do so. And that's what's changed. It's those people have been silenced. And what I'm saying to you is they're there, there's a lot of them there, but they're not able to speak because of the way we have let the politics go. So we need to address that problem, and the way to address it isn't going to be to just insist that I don't want to hear from you, you're just wrong. And so therefore I'm going to just stick at this until I win.
So Rip, given your experience in Detroit, so what would you add to this discussion?
I was asking myself the same question.
I can ask you something else.
Yeah. No, because it's so complex when you're dealing with sort of a total ecology of a place.
Right.
I mean, you can kind of win or lose sometimes, but over the long term, kind of Larry's right. I mean, these things, you have to sort of create mechanisms by which decisions are made better, right? And one of the things that struck me when I came to Kresge, and maybe this was a little bit the point that's already been made, is that the issues come and go. Detroit in 2006 looked pretty good. You had a hip-hop effective mayor, you had lots of cranes on the skyline, and so we chose to work on a bunch of other things, right? All arguably important, but trying to sort of turn around the Detroit economy wasn't one of them. And we made the decision, and this is where I'm trying to slot into Larry and Bob's observations. We made the decision that how you work is, at the very least, as important as what you work on. And so we just had to develop a different musculature as a foundation. People may or may not know that for the better part of 50 years, Kresge did capital challenge grants. We had an algorithm that we applied to a building project. And
when I was dean, one of the things we did was we tore down the Kresge auditorium. They gave us permission.
Keep going, Rip.
That's from this.
It was a nice
Keep
building.
going, Rip.
Okay, so we kind of did our own version of that within the foundation. We basically tore up the Capital Challenge Grant program. And but the question was, here's a body of work that was useful. We were building buildings. What do you replace it with? And so we, 10 years ago, started looking at different subject matter and developed, Larry's list of 6 of the 10 of the 20 that were the most important. But fundamentally, what shifted at Kresge was a way of behaving in the world. And that's, And that's actually why I think Detroit is important to our experience, is that we could have applied many of those tools to any number of things. We didn't have to pick a riverfront. We didn't necessarily have to pick a rail project. We didn't have to pick a neighborhood commercial strategy. We could have done a lot of things. But it did require, to Bob's earlier point, a board that was comfortable with risk, a board that actually would buy the argument that you need to work somehow hand in glove with the public sector, occasionally propping them up, occasionally hitting them across the head, occasionally getting out of the way, whatever it was. Those are all very different constructs because it's messy and it's not at all clear that you can measure it. And so I think Bob and Larry are both right. I mean, how you work is really important. The mechanisms of decision making and problem solving are really important. And that's actually where I do believe that philanthropy can be helpful.
Can I ask a question of Rick?
Sure,
So,
sure.
because I think, from what I understand, I remember reading about the Detroit deal and thinking, what a strange thing that was to do, right? These foundations just put up a whole ton of money to keep an art collection together. Like, if it's money they need, sell the art. It's not going to disappear. It'll just go to other museums. Why would you do that? So, and I'll let you tell, but I've come to understand, right, this was actually part of a really complicated negotiation where all sorts of people had to compromise around things they didn't want. Right, so I mean, I think that would actually probably be useful to explain. It's a weird thing to have done until you understand.
It is a very strange thing to have done if that is your angle in on it. And I think what it became was something more than saving the art or coming up with a fund that would help mitigate the impact on pensioners. Both of those were compelling, neither of which we would have done if they were standalone deals. What we did was assemble a fund that essentially, to Larry's point, essentially permitted us to solve both of those problems. That if you impaired pensions in the city of Detroit, you ran afoul of the state constitution. And there would have been a decade of litigation about whether federal bankruptcy preempts state constitutional protections. You just would have been in court forever, and the bankruptcy would have just gone into a death spiral. On the other hand, if you did sell the art, every donor who has ever contributed to the City of Detroit's art collection would have sued over donor intent and whether there was a public trust. Regardless of what you think about the merits of the issue, it would have been in litigation for a decade. And so the genius of the mediator was to say, we need something that solves both simultaneously, creating a pool that helps buffer the impact on pensioners, creating a pool that constitutes sufficient consideration to essentially take the art back out of the public sector. But then what was so complex about it is that fund actually then leveraged healthcare concessions, leveraged creditor concessions. It became this incredibly complex sort of interweave of considerations. And we attached 27 conditions to our gift that absolutely sort of forced the hand of the governor, forced the hand of the creditors, and even forced the hand of the emergency managers. So it became not just a let's put some money in the pool and buy some art. It was a way to resolve the bankruptcy by taking litigation off the table and moving forward. And in fact, that's what happened. I mean, we had a consensual resolution of the bankruptcy in a year. I mean, look at Stockton, look at Little Rock, look at other places that have been through this. A lot of them are still in bankruptcy.
Yeah, Fred, I just want to lift up a
Sure, go
point
ahead.
out of Rip's story. So, deciding on whether to work with government and how you do. I mean, so the frame is, what's our mission? What's our foundation mission? What are our values that underlie that mission? And what's the strategy? Is there a strategic value to what we're trying to achieve? And there may or may not be a fit in the strategy, because sometimes things happen, like Obamacare, that you didn't anticipate in your 10-year strategic plan, right? But the mission and the values thing has got to be there, right? And what happens through a values orientation is there's a part of what you and your colleagues, Rip, at Kresge and the other partners you've had, Ford and Skillman and Mott and others, where, and this is a thing that I think philanthropy dangerously underspends, I mean, for all of the articles that Pablo Eisenberg has written about how we need to spend more, that's debatable on the money side. We don't spend institutional brand and reputation enough to solve problems, right? And people want us to, right? You had the ability, and just think about it for a second. In the corporate world, there's a lot of worlds out there. We have the gift in this field of fully acting out and expressing our values in virtually everything we do. Right? We may not get to 100%, but I used to work for government. We weren't able to do that. There are folks working in the private corporate sector, maybe not able to do that, where you just sort of compromise to get along. And we are in a field where we have the gift of expressing fully our values. And so I think that's something that we spend a lot of time vigorously and assertively protecting our brand and institution, but we don't think enough about spending it. And a lot of times in working with government, yeah, of course they always want our money to help them solve their problems and make them look good. Most of us don't actually do that. But more often than not, it's the institutional brand that we bring to the table for the right kind of whatever, convening, facilitation, for brokering, for pressuring, for whatever it is. And I think we need to be in the boardroom and at the CEO level a little more comfortable about spending that capital of brand and institution to help government do better by the people.
Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering if the two of you would speak to this, because just as in politics, when you spend that capital, it is not an infinite reserve, and it can be spent badly, or it can backfire. Yeah. And there were times in the last 7 or 8 years in Detroit where we felt we had either overreached or miscalculated. And it was actually quite unsettling to know that you were going to go back to your board, you were going to face a local community. I mean, Kresge only spends about 20% of its dollars in Detroit. I mean, the rest of our work is national, but still we are a deeply connected institution to that place. And one of the things that we got hit on in the aftermath of the bankruptcy was be careful how you do this, because all it takes is a couple of things going south very badly and very publicly for your legitimacy and what limited accountability you have to get spent. And so you both picked big issues. I don't know how you think about that.
I tell you honestly, I don't think about it one way or the other. And I don't think we do as an institution. That is to say, I don't think we spend a whole lot of time thinking about how we're building our brand either. You know, we just do what we do. The one thing that drives us more than anything else is we do have a strong sense that we're not doing anything. It's our grantees who are doing the work. So we do have a general, notion that if somebody's going to be out there, it should be the grantees, and we should promote them in their ability to do it. I think, we're perfect. In Madison, that's an area where we were really, at Madison and cyber both, we started a cyber initiative as well. And in both of those, there's no field yet. So we put ourselves out because we're trying to build the field, and you need to draw some attention to it as grantees emerge and develop and put themselves in a position, unless they want us to, our general preference would be to support them because we're trying to promote, because they're doing the actual work. But as I say, it's weird. I mean, I don't disagree. I don't think we think about it that way. We try stuff. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And then you just have to explain why it didn't work. So we had an initiative we shut down. It was a philanthropy initiative, so it's not quite out there on the, dicey side of things. But, we shut it, the nonprofit marketplace initiative, another initiative. We shut it down. We explained why we shut it down. There was a certain amount of back and forth. Somebody accused us of lying. Like that wasn't really why we were shutting it down. We said, no, it really is. And look, and I don't think you can do more than that. And as long as you are open about why you did what you did and why you think it didn't work, I think you usually come out okay.
Well, let me just say this. I'm sorry, Fred. Let me just get this out there. Because risk can be defined a number of ways. Right? If at no point in a given year in your boardroom you're not having a conversation about something that could go sideways or south that could come back to bite, you're not being risky enough. Okay? And so when we did the Health for All campaign, which sounds wonderful, who could be against it, sort of like on a bumper sticker, we were talking about undocumented children. Okay? And so the conversation in the boardroom is okay, you know, we're going to get hate mail, which we did. We've been mentioned by Rush Limbaugh, not in glowing terms, by the conservative talk radio station, not in glowing terms. And so I would say, you know, for all of us, and this sort of includes working with the government, but outside of working with government, we ought to have a scary conversation about something we're doing in the boardroom once a year. And if you're not, you're probably being too cautious.
No, I think, like I said, I'm not disagreeing with it, but I think it's, to me, that's putting the cart before the horse. You start with your problems. So the first and the important question is, are we working on things that really matter and are worth working on? And then all of them have risks. So I think we're constantly talking about what are the risks of why might this fail, what can go wrong, if it goes wrong, what's going to happen. That's sort of built in, but you lead with the problems, and then, like I say, I mean, if I think across our portfolio, we do climate change, we do Comet Core, we do abortion, you know, it's filled with stuff that presents all sorts of risks, but in none of those, we always went into it saying, God, here's a problem that we think is really important for us to address. And now, do we think we can do anything about it? And then if we got past that, then the conversation is, okay, now let's talk about what the risks are. But I can't think of an instance where the risks stopped us from doing anything. Now, I've only been there 4 years. But so you think about it and you take it into account. But it's just something you take into account once you've decided that there's something worth working on that you think you can do something about.
But see, that's my takeaway
you're
from
the
this.
same, right?
That's my takeaway from this conversation, because you all were willing to take a risk. I mean, Larry, I remember when you announced this, there was criticism that people thought that you could have used your money in a different way. I mean, Bob, that certainly has been the case in things that you have done. There's people perceive this, there's winners and losers. And Rip, I mean, I'm trying to be careful here, but one of the things I've always admired about what you've done in Detroit is you've sort of allowed yourself to be a problem solver and a deal maker. And that's not a normal position for philanthropy. So, you know, that's...
Yeah, but the
you
reason
agree?
why, like taking on climate change, Larry, is politically risky and shouldn't be.
Yeah, I agree.
And the reason why it's politically risky is because we're sending the wrong people to Congress. They're connected.
Sure. Well, why do you think we started the Madison Initiative? Although, you know, we had to spend a lot of time on that, trying to explain over and over again, this is not about achieving the goals of our other programs. We're agnostic. In this initiative, we are agnostic about the outcomes. We just believe that if you get a democratic process that is properly functioning, we have enough faith in our positions that we think we'll do okay in that. If we don't, we don't. That is what democracy is all about. I don't necessarily get to win. On the other hand, I shouldn't lose because the process is completely clogged up and broken. So, you know, so they're connected, but not driven by that.
So let me ask this. This is great. This is exactly what I wanted you all to do, is to have a conversation. But I want to just spend a minute and ask if you would, again, talk with one another about the things that you're learning that might be more generalizable to the field, to people in this audience that are thinking about getting more involved in the space. What advice or what lessons might you give to them?
Let me just start with something that may be just sort of milquetoast and second nature to everybody in the audience, but actually has been profoundly important to our understanding of how to work, which is that the complexity of whether it's a federal, state, or local problem ultimately turns on some solution set that involves multiple sectors. And so getting comfortable with markets, getting comfortable with the public sector, and sort of fully stretching your philanthropic muscle involves, I think, a fairly intricate dance. Our grant making increasingly is not just sort of cross-disciplinary, because health is related to transit, is related to housing, is related to environmental quality. But it also realizes that the dominant actors in each of those problem sets sort of shapeshift. It's not always the government. It may be the markets. In Detroit, in some ways, our largest obstacle was the failure of markets to behave in any kind of way that was supportive of the folks who lived there. I mean, I'm looking at Karen, and who's just come from Flint. I mean, hello. I mean, this is just... that actually, I think, was one of the sort of the educating moments with our board when we had a series of conversations about what are the tools we possess to engage meaningfully with the public sector? What are the tools that we meaningfully possess that meaningfully permit us to engage in the private sector? And that's complex. I mean, that's led us into a fairly complex social investments portfolio. You guys both do it. And again, maybe that's second nature to folks in the room, but I think it's terribly important. And it is, I think, a little bit of a bend in the traditional philanthropic arc to really sort of figure out what that choreography is that pulls people together in some kind of common purpose.
Yeah, Bob?
Yeah, I think for us, it's been, some of you know we're involved in a multi-year sort of place-based health initiative called Building Healthy Communities. And so we're in 14 low-income, distressed communities. And what's been interesting for us is, because we came from the health silo. That's the silo we live in, right? But when you bring yourself down to the level of place, and this is why I think place is a healthy orientation for philanthropy. I'm not saying everyone should do it. But you can't escape the reality of what these folks are dealing with. There is structural inequality everywhere. Just, pick a system. It's structurally inequitable, right? Housing, jobs, economic development, schools, healthcare, just sort of, go down the list. And there's sort of a structural reason why we have these disparities. I would say, and we're about to come out with a 5-year report on the 10-year initiative, what we've learned. We got punched in the mouth about two things. One, economic injustice and income inequality and jobs, right? And so and this is someone who, listen, I grew up in the South Bronx. I had a pediatric practice in North Philly and in Camden. I knew something about these neighborhoods, right? I didn't come from Brentwood to this work, okay? But I have been shocked, and we are shocked, with how structural the inequality is, Rip. And I know you guys are in this space, in particular at Kresge, both about how government and markets fail to advance opportunity in this country. I mean, for all of the noise that our elected officials talk about, we need jobs, and I'm going to create jobs, and I'm going to bring jobs here, and they're not doing anything. There's not the infrastructure around how government and capital markets respond to addressing inequality is really weak, right? That's number one. The second thing we got hit over the head with is mass incarceration. We could not stop hearing about it left, right, and center, and about how the school-to-prison pipeline is fundamentally unhealthy for communities. And so that is not something we anticipated at all when we started on this path 7 years ago, and now we're in it because we were compelled to be in it. But I'm intrigued, and we're intrigued, and we have this conversation in the boardroom all the time, because we want to stay focused on our health mission, but we also understand how fundamental income inequality and lack of capital investment in these communities exacerbates health issues. But we don't want to turn into an economic justice foundation, right? So, I mean, we're struggling with this. I'm just letting you folks know. I'm coming out with what keeps me awake at night. But how we use our juice, and I think you're there, Rip, quite frankly, with Kresge, about how government and markets do better by these kinds of communities because it's smarter for the future of our nation. That's a major, major challenge for philanthropy because I'm not sure who else's job it is to do that, quite frankly.
Larry, you're in sort of early days with the initiative, but are there things you're learning that?
Yeah, so let me, 2 points. I want to add on to sort of Bob's point in a funny sort of way and tie it to the Madison initiative, and then it's a different lesson for me. So we were in Paris for the talks, because we do climate, and on the last day there I did a panel with the head of the European Climate Foundation, just a conversation on stage, and we did our thing, what's the role of philanthropy in climate, yada, 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 and then it's go to Q&A. And the first question from the audience, some guy in the back stands up and he says, you know, this is all very interesting, but don't you have to admit, you know, given the nature of the problem and the time frame we're working in, that we really need to take on what is the real source of the problem, which is, of course, capitalism. And the audience cheered, like, you know, cheered, and I was like,
So
oh, great,
Bernie,
I'm in Europe.
Bernie Sanders was in Paris.
I'm in France. I didn't say what I wanted to say, which was, I will say. What I said there was, you know, actually, I'm surprised.
What did you want to say?
Well, I'll say that in a minute.
Okay.
What I said was, you know, I'm surprised any of you would cheer only because I'll latch on to the part where he said the time frame we have, because we've only got 8 to 15 years or so, and then like all bets are off on climate. And whatever you think about capitalism, you're not going to overturn it in the next 8 to 10 years in China and India and Africa and all these places that are rushing to embrace because they're getting the benefits of it for the first time to some extent. So that was the answer there. What I actually wanted to say was that was really interesting, but I don't know where you people were in the 20th century. Because I think we learned 3 lessons in the 20th century. So 1 is fascism is a really bad idea. 2 is communism is a really bad idea. And 3 is capitalism is a really bad idea. But that what works is capitalism tempered by liberal democracy, which is the New Deal in the US and social democracy in Europe. And those are variations on a theme. And what the Madison Initiative is about is that. It's what's gone wrong in this country, what has created the massive increase in income. And it maps perfectly. Was as soon as the government ceased to be able to act, then you ended up with what we have, which is effectively unbridled capitalism and the inability of liberal democracy to temper it in all the ways that it does, providing a decent social safety net, providing a realistic amount of redistribution of all the things that we can do that we learned in the 20th century are necessary. You can go farther and all, but we're not going to get anywhere on any of them until we get the democracy part functioning again, and in particular, and that's the view, the national government, because these kinds of problems can't be dealt with. The economy is too interlocked across state boundaries to deal with it at the state level or at the local level. If we don't get the national government working again, we're never going to address the inequality issues. So that's what's behind the Madison Initiative. Now, the lesson for me, though, that I think I would say is really the exchange we had about risk, which is, you know, I often say to my staff, like, what is the point of being unaccountable if you never use it? Like, we're not accountable. So I'm not like I say, I think as long as, I think what our responsibility is to think hard about the problems that we're going to address. And they're different for different foundations because we have different missions and histories and so on. Think hard about the problems, pick problems that you think are worthwhile, decide how you're going to address them, and then do it in a way, and then the transparency is so important. Do them in a way that you are comfortable explaining to people. If you wouldn't be comfortable explaining in the New York Times why you're doing what you're doing, then you have to wonder about it. But if you are, then do that, and then don't worry about it. If people punch you in the mouth, as long as you're comfortable with what you did, you say, you know what? Okay, but I did it for this reason, and I still think it's the right thing to do. And if it wasn't, you go, oh, you know, you're right, I was wrong. We'll change. And they can't do anything to us, you know. I mean, we are unaccountable in just that way. So it's like, let's not worry about it so much and just focus on what it is that we think we need to do. And I mean, I think it's amazing. But you know, I'm always jealous because I like the problems I work on, but I like the problems everybody else works on too.
So,
and we can't do all of them.
So let me just ask. I want to ask Rip and Bob one question, and I hope this doesn't seem too far from right field, but both of you in particular talked about sort of the risk that you've taken over the last number of years and really staked out some new territory in philanthropy. That takes a toll on someone in your position. So how do you deal with that? I mean, this is, you know, you're not always, you've been praised, but you've also both been criticized. So how do you address that? How do you take care of yourself?
You know, I actually think Larry's answer is the answer, right? I mean, you choose what you're going to do. You try to do it with integrity and clarity and transparency. And then you remain open to the possibility that you may be wrong.
Yeah.
And for me, the last piece is where occasionally it does take a toll, is that at least at the local level, having an oppositional culture to public sector decision making comes with a real price. Because people, I think understandably, say you have one elected official or group of elected officials who have been charged with the responsibility for that place. It's not like the Congress where you got 435 different perspectives, or a state, all sorts. And if you choose to ally yourself somehow oppositionally to that decision-making structure, it's quite difficult. And we found that in Detroit. There was a period of about 4 years where we were engaging in behaviors, trying to promote issues, trying to solve problems in a way that the mayor fundamentally disagreed with. That's hard, because he may well have been correct. But to Larry's point, we chose our point of entry. We tried to be thoughtful about how to pursue it, and we stuck with our guns. We tried to listen. We tried to make sure that we were taking in what the administration was saying, but at the end of the day, we concluded that we needed to persist.
Yeah.
And that is hard.
Yeah. Bob?
Yeah, I mean, two quick things. I mean, one, a reminder, Flint, Michigan, and Detroit are not outliers. Okay? That is the stuff of what distressed communities all across this country, not just black in Detroit, but rural and white. I mean, this is the face of inequality in America. It just kind of plays out differently. And we just need to get as serious about that as we can. And then secondly, when we try to operate off of our values, and going back to spending the brand and institutional capital, it's for the sake of mission. It's for the sake of people we serve, who we're differentially accountable to. But at least we should be accountable to the mission, right, Larry?
Yeah.
And so that mission is in the faces of, at least in our work, young people in Richmond and Fresno and Long Beach and City Heights and Boyle Heights, right? So we're accountable we're accountable to changing, rather than just helping them beat the odds, to changing the odds for them, right? And so it's not the foundation as superhero for the sake of the headline or the whatever or the award. It's being meaningfully accountable to the mission and the people served by it. Means that I think they actually want to see us in the fight, not doing their work. I mean, the grantees did most of the work of Health for All. We funded it. We gave them some campaign money. But I think they want to see us in the fight. This fight is going to take us being more intentional and leaning into it. And if your model of philanthropy is sort of cut the check and get out the way, because that's the most humble way for philanthropy to be, my lesson is I challenge that notion. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I think it's a under the guise of philanthropic humility, our job is just cut the check and get out the way. I would change the question: are you in the fight or not? And this is climate change, Planned Parenthood, poverty, Flint, Michigan. These are fights. And I think for us in philanthropy, we need to decide whether we're in it or not.
So thank you all. So unfortunately, our time has sort of come to an end, and just a couple comments. Sort of listening to the three of you, I'm I'm reminded, and I hope we're all reminded, of the importance of this work that we're doing. You know, advancing more effective government, not turning your back on a city like Detroit, promoting health care for all. These are really important things. These are noble callings. And, you know, again, it reminds me of the importance of our work. So it also reminds us all of the importance of leadership, decisive leadership, the willingness to sort of take chances and put yourself out there, and as Bob just said, to get in a fight. So things that I think all three of you demonstrate on a daily basis. So I appreciate that, and I think they all deserve a round of applause. So thank you.